like to introduce Dr. John Tanaka. John's another person that I've collaborated with quite a lot, so I have to be careful what I say. But John is an associate professor of agricultural and resource economics at Oregon State University, and actually has the privilege to be able to do this from Union, Oregon, where he's at the Eastern Oregon Agricultural Research Station. And so that's an opportunity. He's really been able to work in rangelands from a location in rangelands. And his research involves the analysis of economics, sustainability issues, and policy related to rangelands and their use.
I'm glad to be here talking about economics, and my voice doesn't carry like Carrie's, so I decided to use this. I'm kind of like Val Anderson. I think he gave you all the answers to my talk when he said, well, just treat the best areas. But I'm also liking, because I was here about the same time doing my graduate degree, and my program was to find out the economically optimal level of how much sagebrush to kill. And I realized as soon as I finished my degree that it was irrelevant, so I never have really done much with it beyond that point in time. But it kind of gets to the question of how social values have changed, what Mark was talking about, what society wanted from rangelands at different points in time. That's going to be some of what I'm going to talk to you today about, but really trying to summarize a whole bunch of different research projects, and so really acknowledge a couple of people that I've worked with quite a bit. Alan Terrell is another range economist down at New Mexico State, and Neil Rimby, one at University of Idaho. Neil's in Caldwell, and I'm in LeGrand, and so we're actually fairly close to each other, so we tend to do lots of things together. And then I had lots of graduate students over the years working on these different projects, different funding sources. The Joint Fire Science one you see up there is the Steppe project that Mark talked about, and Dave Pike and a few others this morning. So I talk about economics and restoration. We're really talking about is how do we make decisions? Okay? And so if I can get one idea across to you today, that's the idea. And when we look at different kinds of these decision-making models, we're trying to look at it from both a public and private standpoint, what the impacts are on both types of decision makers. And really it's the question of who's making the decision and who's also paying the cost, who's getting the benefits from those, and how the different groups respond to different incentives. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is what is economics? Is it just dollars? That's what most people think about when you see the title or economics in the title of a talk. But I'm going to talk also about communities a little bit, not a whole bunch just given time constraints, but how those decisions affect local communities. And in the research that we do, really what we're trying to get at is what can the economic information tell a land manager, whether they're a private land manager or a public land manager, and also the public as they influence both of those. Okay, so just real quickly, most of the times when people talk about economics, it's a financial concern. How much, Val talked about it today. How much does that seed mix cost? How much does it cost to spray herbicide? I don't want to say I could care less about what those numbers are, but that's not what's really the main focus of what we do in economics. Those are important pieces of information, but not the only type of information that we need. And what economists tend to look at is those plus what are called opportunity costs. Those are what you can do with your money, alternative things or your next best alternative. And as I'm going to talk about today, and we talk about ranching, keep this opportunity cost concept in mind, because we know that, I'll come back to that. So, anyway, what you could do with your money besides what you've decided to invest it in. Okay, one way to look at it. So does economics matter when we talk about restoration? It depends. Depends on whether your budgets are limited, whether your time is limited, and whether you have variable response rates. Do you know what's going to happen when you put a treatment out there? Or do you expect different things to happen if you use different amounts of a particular treatment? Okay. This is mostly what I'm going to talk to you today about. So the way we go about this primarily, or we have in the last few years anyway, is to look at private ranch models with public land grazing allotments as part of those. So the public land or the private land where treatments could occur, and we use this long thing, which is basically a long set of computer-generated code, linear programming model that builds upon itself, includes the bioeconomics, both the biological side, ecological side, and the economics. I'll show you a little bit about that. So we do this bioeconomic modeling. What becomes important is we have to understand both the ecology and the economic relationships. So it's not just looking at the dollar side and taking it, but understanding how all the different parts fit together. We use conceptual and mathematical models. It's a linear programming model. So looking at those sorts of relationships. And we use those to evaluate alternatives in the context of a ranching operation. And then taking that the next step and saying, well, ranches are part of communities, and we know that what they do in the aggregate can affect what happens in the community. And we do work with sociologist types that then take that sort of information and talk more about what happens to community structure and function, how it affects people. So in this ranch model, what we have is the basic thing that we look at, or force the model to do, is that it ensures that for every season of the year, there's enough forage for the herd. And the herd changes through the year. Cattle are bought and sold, well, not bought, but raised and sold at different times. Forage grows through the year. We have different places that the cattle herd could be. And it tries to balance all of that out with the treatments that we put in. And then we've also incorporated some risk into it, because if we have perfect information, life would be a lot simpler. So the things that we've looked at this point are looking at a variety of cattle prices. We've included precipitation in there, try to do that in a stochastic manner. And then this last one down here, as part of the Joint Fire Science Project, is looking at fire as a risk factor. My grad student, I leave here and go directly to her defense on Friday. So I'm not going to tell you her results, but maybe. So just pictorially, here's what we're doing. We have the cattle herd changing through the year. You know, the calves born, cull cows sold, calves sold. We have death losses in there that isn't up here. We have the different forage sources and different seasons. And the particular models that we're running, we use up to 7 seasons. I've had students do it on a daily basis. That seemed a little excessive. But the idea is just to give us an idea of what the ranch can look like under these different alternatives. And we give it different choices of feed sources, and the model, that's a profit maximizing model, chooses the least cost source of forage given when it can be used at different times of the year. Some of the issues we run into, a lot of times we give it this private lease option. Now for a single ranch, that's probably okay. When we use the typical ranch for a region, the implication is that every ranch would then go out and search for that private lease. Okay. There's probably not enough in most of the western states to accommodate that, and if there was, and you see it when there's a drought, those lease rates get bid up. And so our model at this point can't really accommodate either of those situations, but we leave it in there as an option, just recognize that that's a problem. The shaded area is mostly the area that we're interested in from early spring to late summer. We've done a variety of different evaluations or impact analyses during that time. We use different combinations of seasons to get at that. So just to show you what we're doing with this, most linear programming models take these sorts of key variables that are related to each other, functional relationships, and then the model gives you an output level, a herd size, a profit level, whatever you're looking for in there. And normally in the first linear programming models we did 20, 30 years ago, that was what we had. We had this one-year type of model. Now what we're doing is taking those outputs from the first year, so the herd size that comes out of the first year, then goes out again as input into the second year, third year, fourth year. So now it takes, if a ranch has to reduce their herd size this year, it takes 6, 7, 8 years for them to get it back up to the size it was before. So the impacts become a little more realistic than the single year impact where we do a before and an after kind of model. So just give you an idea of, real briefly, of what we've done. This is from the cheatgrass study that Dave Pike talked about a little earlier today. Had a grad student looking at a variety of different treatments. Now, the ecologist at the point that he was going through his degree program didn't have these relationships. What happens if we put the herbicide out there? What happens to cheatgrass, and what happens to the native species? So he went to Dave, and blamed Dave for these numbers, and said, okay, give us your best guess at what's going to happen. And so that's what we kind of have up here, and a few others that he talked to, kind of negotiated what the responses would be based on some of their preliminary data and just the experience that they've had. So what we have here is different treatments. The integrated is all three together, the best combination, and different response rates of the cheatgrass and native species for the particular sites in, I think this one was for Oregon. So why is that important? Well, we talked about all day today, the species, and we kind of lumped the natives all together. Cheatgrass and the natives grow at different times of the year. So this graph is just representing the percent of total production by season. These were taken from some of the NRCS plant growth curves for different regions. So this is modeled, and the question is, well, okay, so from the ranching perspective, out here in early spring, in the Intermountain West, that's the time where obviously native forage is limited. So cheatgrass became an alternative, maybe not the most desirable alternative, but it's out there. It grows early, it greens up, and cattle can eat it. Okay. So when we modeled this, then the ranch had the option of either grazing this area in early spring and getting that cheatgrass forage, or delaying grazing on this particular pasture, waiting for the native species to grow. And the question then is, if they wait, so what do they do in spring? And so there were options that the ranch had to look at for in that particular case. So just jumping straight to the results, this is for the Idaho model. These are the 4 treatments plus the baseline, which is obviously no treatment out there. And so for all of these restoration techniques, under those kinds of conditions, those response rates, the ranch loses money. because we were looking at cheatgrass infested rangelands that were basically 100% cheatgrass, that was the main forage before restoration, it lost all of its spring forage. The ranch that we're looking at, the typical ranch, is adapted to that sort of system, and when the treatment came in, took out all of that spring forage, it had to make adjustments. It adjusted by reducing herd size, by increasing hay consumption, all of those kinds of things that caused it to have this reduction in net income. And in all those models, the impact lasted about 13 years, give or take, and it depended on which state and what conditions we were looking at before the ranch came back to where it was pre-treatment. So that's the kind of information we get from these ranch models. I probably jumped ahead too quick, but we've looked at a variety of alternatives. We looked at juniper control, where we have environmental variables as part of the output. That is, changes in soil erosion rates, changes in wildlife habitat, water quality. Where we can find those kinds of relationships, we can put those in. But in all cases, we assume some level, well, not some level, we assume profit maximization as the goal of the model. So what I'm going to spend the rest of my time on is talking about why that's a bad model. So, did this several years ago. It's been about 10 years ago now, so probably needs to be redone. But we did a survey of all public land ranchers in the U.S., BLM and Forest Service permittees. Drew a random sample of those, asked them a overly long questionnaire that they filled out. Had really good response rate. And one of the results that we came up with is there's different kinds of ranchers out there. And we could characterize them by their different types of responses that they had. But it really split out into this part-time ranch, which had derived less than half of their income, total income, from ranching, and the full-time ranchers that derived more than 80% of their income from ranchers, and then these subdivisions in between. I don't know if it still looks like that. I would assume it's not changed a whole lot, but that's something that'd be interesting. But then the idea is we asked a whole bunch of other questions that we could see differences of responses by these different types of ranchers. But in this case, for this particular question of why do you ranch, there was no difference in any of those categories of types of ranchers. They all said the same thing on average. Okay. The most important reason they're ranching is a place to raise their family, tradition, culture, and values, what we typically call as lifestyle reasons. The money, the business, return on investment, profit, are kind of in the middle. So our profit maximizing model probably isn't explaining the response of ranchers as a whole. That's why I said our models aren't really good in that sense. They don't tell us the right answer. They don't tell us how ranchers would really respond given their motivations. Another reason, ranch values. Historically, when I took ranch appraisal class here at Utah State, one of the ways we came to a value was you figured out how many AUMs there were, or how many animal units year long the ranch would carry, and you multiplied it by a value, and you came up with the sale price of the ranch. And that was one of the three ways. They don't even do that anymore on a ranch appraisal very often. Okay. So it was a very production-based way of looking at ranch values. And the question is, does it still hold true? Well, we've been, mostly Terrell and Rimby, been looking at ranch sales in New Mexico and in the Great Basin, looking at trying to explain the sale price based on these characteristics. Flip through there real quick, and just to summarize it, this particular table is from New Mexico. This gray box is the percentage of the ranch sale price that can be explained by production. It's worse in the Great Basin, by the way. So that's one of the reasons appraisers don't use that as a value anymore. So in recent years, last 10, 15 years, ranches aren't being bought and sold based on how many cattle they can run. If you look at this and talk to Alan a little bit, the steepest, roughest ranches sell for the most. It's not how we were trained in range. Or if you're into cattle. But those are the scenic places, right? And in the Southwest, where he's doing a lot of these are mostly public land ranches. 40 acres of deeded, 250,000 acres of public land, selling for millions of dollars. So, this sort of thing. In the Great Basin, it's kind of 0% to some small amount can be explained by production. And so what? I'm probably going over time on it. Get close. Okay, so the question is if policy change affects profitability, what happens? Will the ranch sell to a larger operation, subdivide, or do what? Or will they just do anything? Will it have an effect on what the rancher does? If their goal isn't profit, and if we design incentives based on those dollar amounts. And that's really kind of the question we're trying to look at. Depends on the goals of the rancher. I put this one up as herding. In some of the research we've done, that's seen as an option to keep cattle out of riparian areas, cattle distribution. But if it doesn't fit in with this goals of the rancher, are they going to go out and do it? If it's not part of that lifestyle question, we can show it's profitable for them to do it. But if they don't want to, they're not going to. Same thing with restoration practices and lifestyle. So I better flip through this really quick. So I'm going to talk just real quickly a little bit about a longitudinal study that another graduate student, actually the same graduate student did, where he talked to a small group of people in the 4 states and asked them about some restoration activities. BLM personnel were supportive of those, as you might expect. The ranchers weren't supportive, and that's different than what Mark said. And it's probably different because of the way he asked the questions and analyzed the results. But remember, these were ranchers talking about the 100% cheatgrass dominated rangelands, wanting to know about restoration, knowing that they're going to lose that spring forage if the treatments went in, and we didn't talk about alternatives for that. And interest groups favored the integrated strategy. Remember, on that graph, that's the one where it looked like it dropped off the bottom of the screen, causing the most impact on the ranch operation. Again, that was a case study. It was very small, just trying to get a feeling for what different groups would look at. Last thing I want to talk about is sustainability. It's been mentioned a few times today. And I'll do this really quick. But looking at how all the different pieces fit together when we talk about sustainability, when I use that term, or how it's being used by this Sustainable Rangelands Roundtable, is economic, social, and ecological factors all together, trying to decide what it looks like. That's being put in place by different agencies. These 3 national forests up where I live are using indicators in all 3 categories to define their current management situation, as well as I think we'll use them to look at desired future conditions as well. So, does economics have a role? Just wanting to do restoration may not be enough. I mean, if I step from my economic side and go to my ecology side, I want to do the things that will take care of the land. But just wanting to do that may not be enough. Need to know who gains and who loses and by how much. That's an important question in trying to get buy-in on whether the practices are going to be acceptable to all the different publics that Mark talked about this morning. And we want to design programs that maximize the gains and minimize the losses. Again, the models we've been doing seek to maximize profits, but we know that the managers aren't profit maximizers. Do they still give us good information? I think so. Even for all those ranchers that said profit maximization wasn't the most important thing, they still need to at least break even, right? All those part-time people probably don't want to work full-time somewhere else just to spend all the money back on the ranch. So there's some level of profit that's necessary. It may not be profit maximizing. And then looking at how we can incorporate those sorts of non-profit incentives into the models. And also what are called non-market values. And I talked about the Juniper model that we developed that had wildlife habitat, soil erosion, those kinds of things in there. They weren't part of the decision-making process in that model because we didn't have values, we didn't have the trade-offs for them or the social trade-offs. So the final question I'd like to leave you with, or things to ponder, are the types of managers today different than they were in the past? And will they be different in the future? By types of managers, I'm talking about the values that the managers bring to the table. Does the knowledge of those differences make a difference? How they affect economic and social values? And I contend that they do. So I brought up at the beginning, my first activity was to kill sagebrush, and now we're talking the other way. And that's not because I don't like, well, I shouldn't say that. I don't like to kill sagebrush or grow sagebrush. It's just those are the social values at the time of what managers were looking at doing. And then how does all this imply for incentives or penalties? With NRCS, with the farm bill that was brought up earlier today, how do you get ranchers, landowners to take advantage of those kinds of programs and change management? So, really what we've been talking about today is how we do a balancing act among all these different aspects of natural resources, and then how economics can help us make choices. If there's any questions, I'll take. Yeah.
You mentioned just briefly there at the end, you referred to non-market values, things of that nature, and I think everybody can agree to some degree that one of the reasons we are in the situations that we're in terms of endangered species conservation, ecosystem degradation, those types of things, we're looking at long periods of time in which those types of values, market values, haven't been included into the decision frameworks in terms of what the costs and benefits of things are.
Right.
So the key, in many ways, I think, is in order to provide more balance into the future, is to get at some way of providing getting a better handle on what those town market values are. There's things like contingent valuation models, things like that we can use to get at that. I was wondering if you could talk about those types of things and some avenues that you go down to addressing those types of.
Yeah, there's as part of the Steppe project, there's a group out of University of Nevada, Reno, that are looking at developing some of the non-market valuations using contingent valuation, which is, if you don't know what that is, that's essentially asking people what it's worth, what they'd be willing to pay for a particular resource. And the question that other economists have is whether those are comparable values that you get when you have an actual market. So can you compare what people say they're willing to pay for wildlife habitat with the actual market conditions of raising cattle, for example, if that's a trade-off. The other issue that we have in that is knowing what those trade-offs are ecologically and biologically. And I think we're getting a better handle on that all the time, but we don't always know. When we did the juniper study, for example, one of the things we wanted to put in there is you always hear, if you cut all the juniper off the hillside, all the springs come back to life. Has anyone heard that? Mm-hmm. So how many springs come back to life? And how much water is produced? So we went to the researchers that are looking at that, and they wouldn't even give us a number. So we kind of threw that one out. But that's the kind of information we need when we start talking about non-market valuation and putting them into these sorts of decision models. With the wildlife habitat, we're able to do that a little bit. We talked to some wildlife managers and said, okay, if the world looked like this, how many elk and quail would there be out there? And they could give us some numbers. So we could get a response, but we didn't have the values in there that would allow us to actually make the trade-offs. So that's the idea or the direction we're trying to go, but coming up with those both the relationship and the values has been really difficult.
So are you optimistic that further developments in these types of tools can get us to the point where we can nail those things down better, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think we're working in that direction, and I think getting people, ecologists, economists, and sociologists to think about those relationships together makes us ask the right questions to get the information that we need. So yeah, I think a lot of people are working on that now, but this can take a while.
Great. Well, thank you very much again, John.